got a busy afternoon, so let's get cracking. We'll start with Terri Harrington from the Infrastructure and Projects Authority inside the UK Cabinet Office on an exciting initiative she's working on with almost all major universities in the UK. Terri.
Hi there. I just wanted to take less than 5 minutes of your time because I know we're pressed for time. Can somebody turn my mic on, please? Hello, can you hear me now? Can you hear me if I stand here? Good afternoon, everybody. I just wanted to very briefly tell you all about Project X. You might have heard of it before, but if you haven't, it isn't anything to do with spying, but it was a term that we came up with as a placeholder, and it seems to have stuck. Now, I am the head of Portfolio Insight at the major projects authority, as was the Infrastructure and Projects Authority. So I collect data and the authority has for the last 5 years from all the major projects in government. And we also have an awful lot of other data and information from all the assurance reviews that have carried out on major projects over the years. And I've got 2 really, really good databases of information that has all sorts of stuff in it that you wouldn't even imagine. And when I took over the job about 18 months ago, it seemed to me that we weren't really doing anything with it. And I had the title of Head of Portfolio Insight, but I've got a tiny, tiny little team, and we don't really have the skills and expertise in that team to generate the sorts of insights we wanted to. So I commenced this Project X, which is actually working now with one more university that's on here, the London School of Economics. We've actually got 13 different universities and business schools, all of whom are working and collaborating with us to really start to work out what are the key research questions in government at the moment, and how can we work together, academics, project professionals, professional bodies, private sector organisations, how can we actually work together to develop and drive real insight? I really do believe in what Andrew was saying earlier on about a learning legacy. For me, if we can capture and understand, using the data that we have, we all collectively have, including the data I have, to produce evidence-based research with practical-based outcomes, and we share it with everybody. We share it with MPLA, we share it with the master's course here, we share it with the project professional bodies, we get it out there, we publish it. That is the start for me of actually really learning lessons. I don't know whether I say that. Actually learning the lessons that we all should learn. So what I wanted to do was to say, Project X is open for business now. We already have some funding. We have some researchers, some of whom are here today. And what we're looking to do is to work together, particularly if you've got data or information, or you have a passion for the sort of research that you're all here to hear about. If you want to get in contact with me and say, we'd like to join your club and get involved, our next major conference is going to be in January, which is probably the best time to come along, see what work we've been doing under the key themes that you'll see there, and really start to get involved with us. But I just wanted to say it's really exciting. As I say, we've got a head of steam behind us now. We've already got funding from various research councils, from PMI, from APM, from MPA and others. So you want to come on board, now is the time. And I'd really appreciate your help, because if we do create the insights and we do share all of that information and we do generate new frameworks, new techniques, new tools and share it around, actually all those statistics that Bent put up earlier about failure of major projects delivery might be a thing of the past. So I'd really welcome it if you could actually help me with this venture. So that's my email address, so please do scribble it down and get in contact. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, so we'll move on to our board panel session for the afternoon. I'll moderate that from here so that's not too crowded for them sitting over there. But we're joined by a very distinguished panel. What I'll do, a bit like Professor Mari Sacco today, is introduce each speaker one at a time and ask them a question about their experience and then open the floor to the audience to ask about it. So let's start with David Richter. David, you're one of us. You're one of our alumni in cohort 5. Is a very warm welcome to you. You've been the CEO of Hill International, again, a family-owned business previously, but that has gone public. Boards, particularly in public environments, are seen to be driven by short-termism. And mega projects entail very long-term commitments. What mechanisms does it take to overcome that quarterly earnings pressure?
Well, that's a great question. Public companies like Hill, we've been public now for 10 years. We're sort of in the opposite situation as Bechtel this morning. I'd love to be in Brendan Bechtel's situation and have a private company and not public shareholders to answer to. We went through a proxy fight last year, which we won. We went through another one this year, which it looked like we were going to lose. And we made some changes in the middle of that, got sued, and wound up with a settlement with our activist shareholders that resulted in sort of a split board at our company, a 10-person board with 5 existing incumbent directors, 5 new directors representing the activists and some other major shareholders. And while that may sound like a recipe for deadlock, we viewed it as exactly the opposite, which is it's an opportunity for us to work together. Neither side could sort of force their agenda on the other side. It requires us to work together and focus on what's best for the company, what's best for our shareholders, what's best for our clients. Typically, though, the assumption is that boards have more of a long-term view. It's the management team that really, because they're auditioning for their jobs every 90 days within a public company environment, that are focused on short-term quarterly earnings, while boards are elected sometimes annually, sometimes triannually, as in our case. Focus a little more on the longer term. My experience is it's been the exact opposite. Our management team is focused on the long term, building the business, focused on making investments that pay off long term. Every time we hire a salesperson within our company, it's a short-term cost for a long-term benefit. Our board is actually the one that's been focused more on short-term performance, keeping the shareholders happy, et cetera. But boards and management teams have really very different perspectives. Certainly the role of a director, public, private, public agency, is really a part-time position. Typically, directors serve no more than 20 to 30 days a year, effectively. They really don't have the time, when you're talking about a diverse business that's involved in multiple projects, to manage them directly. It's the management team that has to focus on that because they're working on their roles 24/7. Another difference is that boards have to be big picture. There just isn't enough time during the limited amount of their attention span that they have to focus on the company to really delve into the details of each and every project. Management lives and breathes their projects and their business and their operations on almost a 24/7 basis. Boards also tend to be much more focused on the downside. Mm-hmm. They're looking at risk, looking at compliance issues. They're looking to make sure nothing blows up on their watch, while management really has to focus on seizing opportunity on the positive aspects of the business and the projects that they're involved in. Those are essentially the major differences.
Yeah. Amjad, if I come back to you, of course, are the general manager at Bechtel Infrastructures, EMEA, sort of Middle East, based out of Dubai. You also get involved in Bechtel's projects worldwide. You have tremendous experience working with Bechtel's projects in infrastructure, not just in the Middle East, but all over the world. And you and I, when we were talking last night, had this discussion around the tension between projects and some kind of a corporate level board. Just for the audience, so that we're clear what we're even talking about, how do you see the role of a board vis-a-vis projects?
So
at the corporate and the project level.
So I think if you look at typical sort of a structure that may be put in place for a mega infrastructure project, you will typically have a sort of a non-executive board, and then sort of the equivalent of what David was talking about, a management. So then there's sort of an executive or a management board, and then of course you've got boards of joint ventures and all of your other supply chain below that. So I think if you start at the top at the non-executive board level, and talk about their responsibility and how do they help the team below them and the whole project or the management team deliver, I would say, so the starting point has to be an alignment of goals and making sure that even though they're that one step removed and are watching the big picture, one step removed because your management team is so focused, you develop blind spots. So I think the non-executive board does have a responsibility to maintain that bigger view and where they're going, because they're one step removed. But nevertheless, they have to have the same end game in sight. And I think the other sort of a big contribution from those, let's call them non-executive board, would be shielding the project from certain, let's call them political or other sort of factors that may cause change or interference in the delivery of that project, where they're probably better suited. And typically on those boards, you do have representatives of a lot of the key stakeholders, and therefore they can influence a lot better while the project team can continue focused on the sort of the day-to-day delivery. So they do have a very important role, even though it may be a non-executive and they're not necessarily full-time, either on the job or just in general.
So you mentioned alignment between the management board and the executive board, but what if the goals of the two are fundamentally misaligned? For example, the project is trying to do something in order to change the direction of the company, or in some instances we observe even cannibalize the old institution. So we talked about Tennessee Valley Authority a little bit yesterday. Its history in 1930s was very much to try and bring a new way of doing things in the Department of Interior in the US government. And if an executive board was formed of Department of Interior board members, they had nothing but the failure of the project as their best interest. How do you manage that fundamental misalignment?
So I feel that the membership of that, let's call it the non-executive board, has to be representative somehow and has to have a skin in the game of the mission below. I feel that if you have members in there that have no skin in the game or an interest, I think you will lead to a misalignment, and then the board becomes relatively ineffective in terms of supporting what the mission is being given to the management team. So it has to start with who's on the board. How can they contribute and help? So you may have people that are bringing a different perspective. You may have folks that actually know the business, so they can interpret the data that they're getting from the projects. And then you have to have some members that come from key stakeholders that either control funding or control the environment or the political scheme that's out there. I mean, these are complicated jobs. They'll have many different facets. So I feel the best way to manage that and make sure that we don't get into a misalignment is to make sure that the board is representative of, as the members that are representative of the stakeholder and the scope that's being delivered. If you do have that chance, and chances are the alignment will be there.
Right. And David, just reflecting back on do you find that alignment is relatively easy to achieve?
No, sometimes is achieved by accident, very rarely by purpose. Certainly the reason you have boards and committees is because people have different interests and different groups of stakeholders, and having them come together in alignment is part of the goal, and frankly one of the biggest challenges.
Very good. Let's come back to that, because I want to pry a little bit around what we mean by alignment. But before that, I want to ask Bent. Bent, we talked about the big picture aspect of boards. Now, we saw in your presentation this morning this persistent, systematic data that we observe outcomes are not delivering on time, on cost, on their intended benefits. Are boards doing their job?
No, obviously, some boards are not doing their job in this specific regard. There's a growing awareness, though, that boards need to pay attention to these things, and they actually are responsible for putting in the monitoring and audit systems that will pick up those kinds of data and use those data usefully for the board. So I've been involved with that with some boards, like how do we as a board implement a system that will actually flag to us when there are problems further down in the organization that should be known to the board but currently are not. So some of these problems that we saw in the data are actually caused by problems not being flagged early enough, and therefore being allowed to develop beyond a point where you can actually salvage things. And obviously it's in the board's interest that that doesn't happen. So some boards are concerned about this, and they will put in flagging systems where they will be alerted to things that they weren't alerted to before, so they can actually take care of them early. And like David, I actually find that boards often get involved in the nitty-gritty when things go wrong, because they're concerned about the downside, as David said. So when things go wrong, that's the downside materializing, right? The boards get activated, they get very activated and agitated, and they want to do something about that because they don't like to see that for the organization. So that's one example of where I've been brought in with boards to set up a system where they can take care of this.
So there are quite a few academics in the room. There are also lots of people in the room who are at a point in their careers where they want to acquire board positions. Ben, what's the process by which one gets involved with boards? What sort of things take place in order to be invited, for example?
Well, that depends on in what capacity. So if you're talking about being invited as somebody to help the board out with a specific project, what it takes is typically a project in crisis. So let me give you an example. I was recently called by a board of a major corporation, world famous like Bechtel, and they had this project like what Brendan was talking about this morning. Like one project of the size that you're doing these days can actually bring down the whole company and can certainly damage your reputation beyond repair. And they had one project like that was going wrong, and the CEO of the company decided to fire the director because of this. And the board didn't think that was a good idea, so they fired the CEO. So there you are. You have this huge project, multi-billion-dollar project that can bring down the company, and now it has no director and no CEO, and the board goes like, shit, what do we do now? So that's a typical situation where you'd bring in people like me and advisors and so on, like, what do you do in this situation? First of all, how do you get things back on track? That's the typical break fix that we talk about. It's an extreme break fix, like usually you don't lose the director and the CEO before you call help, but that's what happened in this situation. But that's the typical situation where you're being called in, unfortunately, is when things are breaking or have broken and you need to bring them back on track. And then you need to set up the governance and reporting structure that can actually make things work out and complete things without bringing down the company and hopefully with some kind of dignity for the organization and not too big of a loss. So that's the typical situation. The other way to be brought in, of course, is as a board member, but that's completely different. You're invited to become a member of the board.
Terri, if I could pick your brain on, it's complicated enough in the private sector, the setup of board and the board governance. What about the public sector? How does project boards, all the variety of governance mechanisms around it, even work?
I'm just looking at some of my public sector colleagues here and saying I think the answer to that is it depends. So across the major projects in government, there's 18 departments, government departments currently running those. And I'd like to say that there's some consistency about the structure and organisation that they use to run those major projects, but the reality is there's very little at the moment. I think there's an increasing recognition that because major departments have many hundreds of projects often, some of which are considered to be government major projects, but equally very, very large projects in anybody's terms, that departments actually operate a portfolio board where that portfolio is really accountable and responsible for understanding all the different projects, how they relate to each other, and what resourcing and types of capacity is required to actually deliver those successfully. And I think that the departments that are the most successful, and I could tell you which they are, but you'd have to shoot me at this, actually are the ones that really get that. They really get the fact that you need to understand what are all the different change activities that are going on, and therefore how can we make sure we have a plan that integrates all of those things, and therefore how can we present that to the higher level boards so that boards can actually understand what's going on. I mean, in my experience, you're right, I think it's when something goes wrong, the board is going to be delving right into the detail of a specific project, But actually, that is probably wasted time. What they really need to do is to understand the overall holistic environment of projects, and therefore they can understand and see what the triggers are to demonstrate that something's likely to go wrong. So if you know that this project over here needs to be delivered before could get to this one here, I mean, the level of maturity of some of our portfolio management is not even good enough to detect the critical path of these various activities. So, but then saying that, there are some departments, I mean, so I've got a couple of colleagues at the front here, and I know they commit a lot of time and effort to trying to really understand the portfolio and make sure that the board understands the data, understands the information, and can see the triggers as they're coming up. So it's very difficult. The data I get at the centre of government that I mentioned earlier is really important as well, because people forget that actually we feed that up to the Prime Minister via the various ministers, the Cabinet Secretary and the ministers. And so we're almost a portfolio board in the Infrastructure and Projects Authority ourselves. So we get a lot of data and information, which I have to interpret, and then that will go up, as I say, as far as number 10 to say, you need to be aware that Crossrail, of course, we just heard is doing marvellously, whereas actually, you know, these projects over here are doing less well. So there's so many different layers of governance that are really key here. But I have to say, in government terms, the departments that have got the most effective portfolio management are the ones that seem to be the most capable of keeping projects on track at the moment. And as I say, I've got such a lot of interesting information about that I think we ought to be turning into insights that we can all learn from.
And what sort of behaviours do these boards have that are delivering these successful projects?
So, on the assumption they're delivering successful projects, I think, again, it varies. I mean, it wasn't very long ago that I was hauled before a Director General who isn't here, and I won't say who it was, and I won't say which department, to justify the fact that I asked for data every quarter. They couldn't understand the value of data. Why do you need data to run projects? We understand what we're doing. We really don't need to be bothering with data at all. We just know how to do it. That's on the one hand behaviours that we see, and on the other hand, we have people who really understand the importance of getting under the skin of what's going on, of seeing how similar projects elsewhere have been run. I mean, some of the work that Bent and his colleagues have done on reference class forecasting and optimism bias, take all of that stuff really, really seriously and make sure they bake it into their business cases. So I think in terms of what makes it successful, it's actually understanding and recognising how important it is. It isn't just about what is the pet project of the minister, which is actually what drives a lot of our activity. What's important is how does all that fit together and what is deliverable.
Thank you. If we could have a roving microphone down here, please. I think one of the speakers would like. But whilst we do that, Raj, you work in an emerging market context. You work in Indonesia. You're the managing director of Tusk Advisory. You have relationships with state-owned enterprises in Indonesia, many of them very large, that people in Western context may not even have heard about. What is the state of governance in these large, publicly owned, publicly influenced corporations in Asia and elsewhere?
I guess, as Atif mentioned, I work quite a lot in Indonesia, though we are a regional firm. One of the uniqueness of Indonesia is that the boards per se is not unlike, say, a common board where it supervises the management. The board is the management. And the supervisory role is through a board of commissioners, and they are appointed, particularly for a state-owned enterprise, they're appointed by the government. The board is the management team, and Indonesia has a unique scenario where the board is personally liable for any notion of a state loss. And if you cause a state loss, you don't just get sacked, you may get sued. So therefore, there is a stronger level of, if you want to call it governance, yes, but sometimes that also then leads to inertia. Nothing happens because they are so scared to do anything that would require managing a risk. We advise a state-owned enterprise. In fact, I was interested in what Bent was saying earlier. We were nominated by the government to advise the state-owned enterprise, which has been given about $20 billion project to build about 2,600 kilometers of toll road in the island of Sumatra. And it's a 60-year-old company, had a CEO who's been there for 2-3 years, and nothing moved. And we were then sent by the government to help the board. And within 2 weeks, our recommendation is to change the CEO. Because from his perspective, he's a contractor. He says, look, I've been around for 60 years building roads. I know how to build roads, so I don't need to do anything that is different in terms of managing this major project. And what we were trying to tell them is, you've been a contractor. There's a huge mental difference between being a contractor to owner and operator of 2,600 kilometers of toll road. That's a complete mindset change. You can't run it in the way and how the history in Indonesia is, it's taken them almost 30 years to build 700 kilometers. And he has a mandate to build 2,600 kilometers in 10 years. So now they changed the CEO, they brought in professional managers, and fortunately they hired us as well. We have about half a dozen consultants working with them to move it forward. And one of the first things we did was actually to train the board, the management board, that they need to understand it requires a mindset change, that you need to stop thinking like a contractor, but think like an owner, in which case then the way you would treat the project is different. So yes, we find particularly unique in Indonesia is the fact that the governance is more personally liability related, which is a bit different from, say, in Australia or here.
And does that personal liability improve outcomes of the investments they're making?
To an extent, yes. One of the things that they tend to do is to mitigate the level of personal liabilities. They set up a series of subsidiaries, SPVs, so to speak, because once you're a subsidiary of a state-owned enterprise, then you're no longer a state-owned enterprise, so your responsibility is a little bit lesser. But then that dilutes the level of governance and ends up creating a series of companies that, in some cases, do the same thing. So there's a huge level of duplication.
And when does that turn into a political witch hunt?
When there's a government change.
Right.
Which happens every 5 years, or 4 years.
So that's actually a good point. We discussed myopia of quarterly earnings in a private sector, publicly listed company context. But politics, both relevant to both Terri and Raj, has its own cycle of myopia driven by the election cycle, as well as the comings and goings of fickle ministers, etc. How does that affect the way boards govern in data familiar to you?
Well, it's quite recently we had the spending round, the tail end of last year, and that was when I joined the IPA. And what was really obvious was nobody was really doing anything in the sort of 6 to 9 months before the spending round, because they didn't want to be committing to spend any substantial amounts of money in case the money was then taken away from them. And then when the spending round happened, departments were actually charged to think about how they could reduce spend on everything, basically, and then there could be a prioritisation made. And then they had to try to sort of very quickly work out how can you kickstart the project again. A lot of our projects, if you looked at a graph, if I could show you a graph of major projects in government at the moment, you'd see that a lot of them are actually intended to be delivered in 5 years, and that tells you everything, I think. But the trouble is, at the start of that period, as I've just mentioned, and at the end of that period, you sort of lose in it. And so there's sort of like a gap of about 2 or 3 years. And if you're talking about a major project, we do a lot of transformation. 70% of projects in government are transformation at the moment. They're not the big infrastructure that you guys have been talking about today. But even those sort of projects, the transformations, they take longer than 5 years. So the fact that, you have this hiatus before a spending review, you then sort of try to kick it off and get going as quickly as possible, but then where's the capacity because people have gone off to other jobs, etc., and then you get into that cycle again, means that even the shorter-lived projects are impacted. And you can just imagine what happens to the longer ones. And I think it is one of the reasons that actually government projects, you find that, original estimates of time in particular, and time relates to money quite often. So that's one of the reasons I think that such a large proportion of projects don't appear to deliver to time, cost, quality, because there's nothing the departments can do. They can't say, okay, hurry up and get elected so you can tell us whether we can spend the money. We have to wait until you're in the position to say, yes, go ahead with something, and that creates a massive difference
Raj?
I guess in Indonesia, unlike, say, other countries within Southeast Asia, for example, Malaysia, Singapore, say the top 10 construction companies, which mainly be involved in major projects, are all privately owned. In Indonesia, top 10, 6 of them are government owned. So as a result, the level of efficiency is not necessarily there, and there is a sense of inertia. If it's closer to an election, then we find the state-owned enterprises board really do nothing because they're not sure whether they will be around post the change of elections. So yeah, it's not an ideal scenario given that majority of the entities that are involved in major projects are state-owned. But the good thing is that the current Minister for State-Owned Enterprises, she is a former CEO of one of the largest companies in Indonesia. Her mandate that she's officially announced is that she wants to be the last Minister for State-Owned Enterprises. And one of the things that she's looking at is to convert the 140 enterprises, starting with the 40, by converting the 40 into 6 companies, 6 large companies, and allowing them to be run like a private firm in a true sense of the word, with government simply holding some notion of a golden share. That's a very, very impressive move, and we are supporting that process as well. So I think going forward that there will be greater governance and greater, I'm hoping, productivity, if you like, from the state-owned enterprises.
Would anybody, any of the panelists like to reflect any governance models that have helped overcome either political or financial myopia, that allow boards to act as long-term stewards?
I would say, I think that when financing is involved and you structure boards and the governance structure such that new finances is arranged and not necessarily coming through the government but other sources. I think that does motivate and bring these boards together in a little different way. So if you look at sort of the privatized projects, even though they may be very long term, the fact that they go out and raise the finance and have an obligation to pay it back, that does tend to create a little bit of a different structure and a motivation for the boards to be engaged in a different way in the long term and not suffer from the sort of a myopia where you're just on some sort of a government funding. So I feel that in those instances, you don't have the same sort of challenges at the board level.
Right.
But then you have more control of the board too.
Right. Bent?
Yeah, so Brendan Bechtel was giving an example this morning. So if you're family owned and you don't have to report quarterly and so on, that also helps. And if you have this long legacy, 118 years, and it's one of your primary goals is to actually also be there in another 118 years. That changes the perspective. That gives, if a board really takes that on board, literally, then that means that you get the kind of long-term perspective that you're asking for. I can give another example. I'm a governor at my college here at Oxford University, and I would say the colleges here and the university in general has this kind of long-term perspective. So building a school like the business school here is a major project. Developing a business school like this within Oxford University, and it is something that is taken, the university is really taking a long-term perspective, and so are the colleges. It's very interesting to be involved in construction projects within the university and outside the university. And you can, if you use your eyes, you can see it as you walk around the town here. You can see that within the colleges, if you check the build quality, it's like things are built to last 300 years because that's the way you think on the governing body of a college here or of a department or in the university in general, because we've been here not just 118 years, but 850 years, and people actually take that legacy seriously, thinking, like Brendan said, we want to be here in another 850 years, not personally, obviously, but we want to, it's an honor to work in an institution and make a contribution to that kind of development, you know, and people take that seriously here, so you make those kind of decisions. So you look at the buildings inside the university and you look at the buildings outside the university. Outside the university, they're crap. Inside the university, they are quality. So roughly saying, there are bad examples inside, there are good examples outside, but statistically, I would say that what I'm saying would hold up to scientific study. So that's another example.
Yeah. So I accept
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I accept, Bent, your hypothesis that long-term finance and the culture is quite important. So Oxford Colleges, one of our colleagues, Professor Paolo Catroni, has done a lot of work on unusual organizations, or what he calls mission-driven organizations, like Christ Church, one of the colleges in Oxford, or the Society of Jesus that him and I have some bizarre obsession with. And you know, we find that you know, these organizations have this ability to have very long survival scales. And it's true of a lot of UK government departments as well. Customs has been collecting customs in this country since 1066. And you know, there's that longevity that is there, whereas most private firms die within 50 years of their formation or get bought out. So you know, there is that tension. But what I would still challenge on and try and tease out a little bit more, ThyssenKrupp is a large German steel company. Anybody know ThyssenKrupp or work for them? A few people. They made, you know, largely owned by a foundation, a family foundation. So very long-term finance, unhindered by publicly listed investors, and certainly no hedge funds or hot money involved in this. They not only did not control the downside risk, they forced their management against its will to make a series of blunderous investments in steel plants in the US, Brazil, and China that have practically bankrupted a nearly 200-year-old company. And they've had to have a massive injection from a private equity fund, Savian, to try and save them. So it seems to me, I mean, one case might be an outlier, but it seems to me that long-term finance doesn't necessarily safeguard against boards not doing their job. There's more to it, this puzzle, than just long-term finance. So if I could push the panel to think a little bit harder on where else, and the room, by the way, there's a lot of experienced people in the room. What else do boards, what else the governance needs? I'd actually like to call Gerard Newman from PwC, one of the partners, to reflect on this. He's been doing a lot of work on that. So Gerard.
Thanks very much, Atif. I was very interested, by the way, just before I was going to say what I was going to say about Raj's example of the management technique or incentivization in Indonesia. It sounds rather like sort of the beatings will continue until morale improves, which as a management technique has probably, from experience, not proved to be very effective. So I just wanted to make a couple of observations, which I think we'd value the panel's view on. And this is in the context of thinking about major programs perhaps being a little bit more like running a large public corporation than sort of a fuel-injected project. So the first observation is that if you run a large public corporation, then there's a whole panoply of rules, regulations, governance structures, transparency, disclosure that you are required to adopt, quite often set out in statute. And for many large major programs, particularly those that are sponsored by the public sector, there isn't really an equivalent of that framework. The second, which is an associated but slightly different point, is that in the theme of looking at legacy and success of, or otherwise, of major programs, is that the perception of success is usually something that is not judged by the board. It's judged by a wider group of stakeholders. And I think that's associated with a point about our Western models of governance, and we were referring to some of them in the discussion, particularly from Anglo-Saxon models, are models of governance which are designed to protect shareholder interest. rather than a wider stakeholder interest. So, I mean, is it actually not time, not just for major programs, but in fact for corporate governance anyway, to think about the shift in accountability and responsibility and value judgment to a wider stakeholder group rather than shareholders, which it seems to me is particularly pertinent to major programs?
Absolutely. So how are stakeholder interests managed in projects familiar to you through the governance mechanism? David.
Oh, I'm sorry. This has sort of evolved from a conversation about project governance to more toward corporate governance. Certainly on the private side, the trends that we've seen in the last several decades, from private equity to the rise of activist shareholders, certainly aren't rewarding public companies for being public. There are advantages, there are pros and cons of being public, there are pros and cons of being private. The biggest advantage for us when we went public was access to capital, liquidity for our shareholders, the ability to spread equity to our management team, which as a private family-held business we really couldn't do. And the downside, of course, is that you now report to other people who have interests, and those people change daily. Every day stock is bought and sold on the exchange. The shareholders that you have relationships with and very positively one day disappear, and new shareholders come in with different agendas. It's an ever-changing process. Certainly public sector boards, there's more long-term stability. But again, as we saw just this past week, governance changes every 4 years, generally, sometimes more often. Organizations have to be responsive, have to adjust to different agendas, changing agendas. And it requires a lot of nimbleness by not just managers, but by boards and how they interact with each other.
Anybody else on the panel like to reflect?
I guess from, say, emerging market side, or particularly on Indonesia, I think in terms of what you were saying, the benefit to the stakeholders rather than necessarily just the shareholders, that's quite an important aspect, particularly in, we are advising on the first MRT project in Jakarta where considerable length of the rail line is underground in below the main thoroughfare in Jakarta. I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with Jakarta. This notion of traffic jam in Jakarta it's not something that you could comprehend. The notion of being stuck in car for 3 to 4 hours is pretty common, particularly when it starts to rain. But they do have reasonably solid infrastructure, but it's just either poorly planned in terms of not connecting the way they normally should. But we find that for the MRT project, one of the key benefits they did after the project started, because initially when the project started, the public was not really on board because of the notion of they had to sell their land and there was a lot of disruptions, etc. This idea of not in my backyard concept was very, very strong. But I think about 6 months after the project started, we were able to convince the board to actually hire a community consultation specialist to actually start involving the public and informing them what will this be a net benefit to them and how will it be a net benefit to them. So I think that changed quite a lot, and now the public's perception is very positive. And the other positive component, when the project started, there was because it's funded through an ODA scheme by Japan, there was a overwhelming belief that we'll all be entirely built by Japanese. And it didn't turn out that way. It's now been almost 18 months. Almost every contractor and consultant in Indonesia is involved in some component of the project. And that is, again, we've been able to get that out to the public to show that actually Indonesians are building these major projects in Indonesia It's not just being built by a bunch of foreigners. So again, that created a stronger sense of buy-in from the public, and yeah, I think it made a huge difference. Recognizing that the stakeholders are a lot more important than just the shareholder in this case.
So we have three emerging hypotheses from the panel. One is that better governance, long-term finance underpins better governance. And that enables people to think longer term, just simply in terms of the timescales they have. Second, that stakeholder rather than shareholder value improves governance, that leads boards to do better. And third, that I'm sort of hearing and implicit in lots of things people have said, that better reporting, more data enables better governance. Am I summarizing what you've said so far reasonably? What are some challenges to these three hypotheses from the floor? The gentleman over here. And then the gentleman over there after you. So we'll take your question and then of Ben Forey there.
Andrew Carney from a company called CPAM. We've been working on a lot of the international projects, particularly in the Middle East, and some of them in the UK here, where we're part of the supply chain delivering for the international companies. We're seeing a huge difference in the approach used by Bechtel, who we would class as a first-tier contractor or PMC company, versus the second-tier PMC companies that are taking on the risk associated with these major projects. What's your view in terms of having the supply chain be representative on the boards of the international projects?
So this is the supply chain.
I talk about that. I mean, that's not uncommon, but I think we should just go back to sort of a clarity on these boards. And I think David has been talking about sort of the corporate structure. I've been talking a bit more about boards related to, or that are set up specifically for a mega project, or it could be a P3 sort of an arrangement or something like that. And I think when you're talking in terms of project-specific boards, there are examples of major suppliers that do form or have a fairly big piece of the project to be part of the board, and you may still need something above that, but in terms of the management board level, there's absolutely no reason why they're not in it. As a matter of fact, quite often on the management board level, you will have them, and it helps to have them.
Can I broaden your question? So the question is, do supply chain or main suppliers should be on the board? But the broader question is, who should be on the board? How do you decide who do you put on the board in terms of, do you give a voice on a seat on the table to your community organizers, or people who deal with the government, or how do you decide who to include and who to exclude?
So I would say that one of the things that you'll have to clarify is sort of the charter given to the board. If there are some governance issues that probably has to be dealt with a little bit differently in a different structure, and maybe that requires a different sort of a set-aside governance structure or board. But in terms of if you're looking at a specific project level or management level board, then I would say it makes a lot of sense to have those key stakeholders and suppliers on that board to help facilitate the day-to-day issues. And again, I go back to get an alignment between them.
So Amjad, what do you make of the UK government's failing plans to introduce employees into boards in projects and corporations?
I don't have a view on that. Maybe somebody else is better placed to talk about that.
I have a fairly strong view, so I'm happy to answer that. I think the historical practice in a lot of places, Germany is one, Japan's another, of having labor unions represented on corporate boards is a disaster. And it goes back to the question of who are the stakeholders that you're looking out for? Certainly in the private sector, it's shareholders. And by law, it's the shareholders. Now, could other stakeholders be factored in? Yeah, of course. And there are some places, certainly outside the U.S., that by laws. There are other stakeholders, certainly the employees, the local community, the environment, all sorts of things. But you've got to look at what the purpose of the business is, or the organization. If you've got a board that is an advisory board, that certainly within the construction sector is some kind of partnering or alliancing, or they call in the U.S. IPD, Integrated Project Delivery. If it's an advisory board focused on a project and how to make that project successful, the more stakeholders involved, the better. If you're talking about the board of a corporation whose job is to make a profit, you probably don't want representatives of the labor unions or the employees on the board because they have a conflict of interest.
Question of alignment. Julie Taylor, microphone's coming to you.
Oh, hi, I'm Julie Taylor from the Ministry of Defence here in the UK. I just wanted to throw in a challenge, Atif, to your hypotheses and get the panel's opinion on this, which is that we're talking all about structures, which I definitely agree with. I'm a bureaucrat, after all. But I have seen boards operate really, really, really effectively, and I've seen boards operate really poorly. And to me, there's a huge factor of just the talent that's on the board. The question of the intelligence of the people on the board, the question of the character and attitude of the people on the board, the question of their experience, the question of what information they have, and so on and so forth. And I would challenge your question about whether the company that ruined itself by making the wrong investments was actually poorly governed, or whether actually some board members made a very bad judgment. And we are sort of slightly having content-free discussion here about the who of this. And, some people just seem to be better. We all face situations in which our tactical incentives do not line up with the strategy. All of us every day. Government, we have that in spades, as Terri said, but everybody has that. Some people just seem to be better at navigating that and keeping to the point and staying in the long-term direction. And I'm just wondering if there's any way that we could try and improve our governance through thinking about that as much as thinking about the structures and the methods.
Brilliant point. So far, the hypotheses that have come from the panel are quite technical in nature. Better data, who you put on the board, etc. But I think Julie's point is that culture matters as much. The culture of governance, the attitudes, the character of people. What are panel's responses?
I think that Julie was also talking about the skills and experience of the people on the board, actually. That's how I interpreted it. And I think that, project management as a profession has not really been recognised until the last sort of 5 years or so. And I think it's only now that senior people, certainly in government departments, are recognising how important it is to sort of understand the basics about project management, so that, data sounds technical, but actually all it is presenting information that people need to have experience to understand, so that they can then interpret it and then they can make the right judgments. So certainly we take it very seriously in the Infrastructure and Projects Authority, and we've just launched our new programme for Director General level people who aren't normally involved in this sort of training activity, which is run here from Saïd. So I'm doing a plug for Saïd University at the moment, the Orchestrating Major Projects. But I think that, the Major Projects Leadership Academy, the master's course that you've all been on, all of you now, when you sit on board, you are going to have a much better opportunity to understand what comes to you and make the right decisions. But I think in the past, we've had a lot of people with vested interests and also people without that skills and experience that haven't been able to interpret the information. So I think there's a capability issue, really. And I think that's what you were saying, but I think we're trying to tackle it, but there's a long, long way to go.
The other thing that we find in Indonesia, some of the state-owned enterprises, particularly like, say, airport operators and port operators, historically the boards have been occupied by Indonesians or locals, if you like, and in the last 3 to 4 years, one of the mindset change that they are bringing on board is to add diversity, and not diversity necessarily just by men versus women, but more by bringing people coming from a completely different environment. So now we have on the board of the port company, we have an Australian, we have an English gentleman, so that they bring different perspective and different way of dealing with the CEO, for example, because, Eastern culture, they tend not to speak against the elders, so to speak, and then you have someone who doesn't come from that culture, and that is actually been quite useful. So I think adding diversity to the board is actually adding value that we find, and one of the key recommendations we've always made, for example, we set up this new body called KPPIP. It's just an acronym. Basically, it's the body that manages about 225 projects of the government for the next 5 years. And out of that 225, 30 projects are the priority of the government to the tune of roughly about $100 billion. There's a committee that has been set up to coordinate the delivery. So they don't actually own the project. They just happen to be like a program management office that works with, say, the Minister of Public Works or Minister of Transport, etc., to coordinate the delivery. The head is an Australian, because we insisted that we needed somebody who've actually done it before, and that's working quite well. And it's sort of bringing quite a lot of different mindsets to running major programs that's very unique to and new to the Indonesians, where they're going, wow, this is not done before. And I think that's another value that boards can add, that not to have this notion of a groupthink, but to bring in at least one or two outsiders. I think that's useful.
One of the first concepts that we learned in the MPM program was that a project or program isn't necessarily a concrete thing as much as it is an organization. And it's the people driving the project or the program. The same thing is true of a board. Boards are only going to be as good as the people on them.
Ben, did you have reflections on that?
Yeah, no, I agree very much with that. You need to have high quality people on the board, but there's also certain insights or habits that the board needs to be aware of, and bad habits that you need to get rid of. So one bad habit is, in most organizations, projects are seen as something you can decentralize. As soon as something is defined as a project, it's also decentralized in the organization. So it's demoted down in most cases. So the CEO will say, well, it's a project now, it's been defined as a project, and it's been delegated to the project director, right? And now we are assuming that the project director will take care of it. For mega projects, that's a huge mistake. I have a slogan that is, mega projects belong in the C-suite. Mega projects belong on the table of the CEO and the chairman of the organization, which means they belong in the C-suite and on the board. Most organizations do not do that. They don't practice it because they're in the habit of seeing projects as something that can be delegated. It's wrong and it's dangerous because, as we've talked about several times today, mega projects can kill you. If they go wrong, they can kill your organization, either financially or reputation-wise. And that's why the projects belong with the CEO and the chairman. So that's one thing, one bad habit that the board needs to root out. So you should only hire board members that actually see things this way, and the board should only hire CEOs, that see things this way, in order to make sure that the mega projects get the attention. So I'm talking about organizations that live and die on mega projects now. I'm not talking about any organization here, but organizations that are doing these multi-billion-dollar things. Another thing is the data. There's also bad habits there, and I agree with Terri that data is not a technical thing. It's actually amazing to see today, how seriously data are taken in Silicon Valley and with companies like Amazon and so on. You have these hugely successful companies, and they are successful because and only because they understand big data. That's what they do. And then we have our sector, where to get people even to accept data, like the example you gave before, which I come across all the time, the vast majority of organizations, including project organizations, are just not interested in data. We know how to do things, like Terri said, so we don't need to look at the data. We don't need to look back. One of the worst sectors in this regard are the banks. The huge banks that are doing huge IT, multi-billion-dollar IT projects on a regular basis. And nobody can afford to be sluggish or wrong. Nobody can afford it less than banks right now. They are so ready for disruption. If we think the auto industry is ready for disruption, think about the banks. They are much more ready for disruption, and construction, much more ready than construction for disruption, and they still screw up their projects on a regular basis. The vast majority of banks have no clue about how their projects are doing because they're not interested in data. They're like Terri says, we know how to do this. We don't need to look back. We don't need to analyze. We don't need to have an analytics. We don't need to look at big data. Let's just do the next project. And it's a scary thought, but people are actually more happy to do something that they are comfortable with, even if it's failing projects, than to do something that they're not comfortable with, which would be to be successful with projects. Because they're not used to being successful, they say, hey, we're not going there. It's something that we're not usually doing. But they will do projects that fail over and over again, and banks are a great example of that. So those are bad habits that we need to get rid of. Get the projects into the C-suite and begin to take big data seriously.
So we have more, thanks for pushing the panel, we have more hypotheses emerging. Things like diversity improves outcomes. And my ThyssenKrupp example is a testament to that very hypothesis. When they went in their investments into China, Brazil, the US, it was all middle-aged, white, German engineers called Henrik. And it's no wonder they couldn't understand anything about China. They couldn't understand anything about doing business in Brazil. And a tokenism, so they brought in one Chinese person who had gone to university in Germany and then had changed his Chinese name to Henrik as a token board member. And that doesn't help either. So it's got to be real diversity. Another hypothesis that just emerged from this conversation is that governance is not a technical thing, it's a social system. And with its attendant complexity and diversity and cultural subtlety. And I think one final thing that's come up really strongly is that mega projects in particular belong in the C-suite. So even if you have suppliers or not have a seat on the board, the mega projects need to be on the board and represented very strongly. So those are sort of some of the modifications we made. Ben Fourie, he's one of our students. I must acknowledge he's the one who inspired this panel in his admissions interview, when he said he wanted to understand over the course of 2 years whilst he was here, how could boards think more long term? So we have Ben to thank for it. So Ben, would you like to ask a question to the panel?
Thank you, Atif. My name is Ben Fourie. I'm a veteran student and a very veteran program director. Never made it to the board, and I don't want to be honest. I think I'm too truthful for that. So I think, Ben, one of the bad habits that I think I found at boards, and this is the view expressed by many other program directors, is that boards don't understand the difference between the business they run and the program they're steering, because there are differences. More often than not, the talent review process, the talent management process, the commercial constructs, the change control processes, the implications of change, the scope change, the pace of the host organization, the pace of the program, and the due diligence and appetite for risk management is so misaligned. And I've also spoken to many non-execs who's on FTSE 50 boards, and they say it goes over their head. When the program director comes in and gives a presentation, they just don't understand what he's saying. And program directors say they often have to dumb down the presentation to the board. So my question is, why are program boards, and is that something that you find, that program boards are not adequately skilled and educated to govern and steer a program? And why are they not doing that? Because it has to be more than that. Programs fail a lot, and the program boards for sure have a role to play in that. They have the most authority and the most power in that governance construct. So what's happening?
If you take, for example, a mega project that goes across several counties or jurisdictions, you would then find, and the funding somehow is related to their tax base, etc., you'll find that each one of those counties or areas is going to want to have a representative on that board. So I'm just using it as an example. Well, those folks are not necessarily project people. They're there to just sort of keep an eye and make sure that their piece is taken care of. So I think sometimes on these complex projects that are government funded and they do go through at a large scale, it's very difficult to avoid having folks on that board that don't understand necessarily the scope of what you're building. So I feel that at times, and you don't want to keep bringing more and more people, because there's the bigger the board becomes, the harder it becomes to manage. And so I think it's a challenge. It's a challenge but you can't avoid it either, because they're key stakeholders, and some of them are bringing the funding for you. So I don't think there's an easy solution. I would say probably the best that could happen is the remaining folks that are on the board that needs to be that much better in terms of their technical competence and and commercial competence and program management competence to balance that. That's just a view.
Yeah, I think there's two fundamental points in answer to your question. One is that boards very rarely get credit for success, but they always get blamed for failure. So a lot of what a board does is trying to avoid failure, not trying to succeed. A lot of the actions they take, the issues they study, the way they make decisions is all CYA. And it doesn't lead to the best solution, but it often doesn't lead to the worst solution either. So it's sort of a middle of the road answer to most problems. The second thing is getting back to the diversity issue. Boards are put together. The very reason they exist is because no single person has all the expertise all of the time on every problem. So you get people that have financial and legal and operational and technical experience and expertise put on a board. And when an issue comes up, there's always one person that's best capable of dealing with that issue. And you get what Raj mentioned before, which is groupthink. And everybody sort of wants to go with the crowd, and they sort of rely on the one person that's got the most expertise, and they don't question it. They don't want to be divisive. They all want to get along. They want to have a nice dinner after the board meeting's over. And it always reminds me of the concept of democracy, which is that obviously democracy is the worst way to manage any kind of a government, except for all the others that have ever been invented. And boards of directors are the same way.
Isn't there also something here about the language? So you talked about a program director going to a board and blinding people with science. And the reality is, if you can't actually explain in words that people understand what is actually going on, then that's a real failure. And I think part of the problem is actually, in reality, some people on some boards don't actually want to hear that the project isn't on track. They don't really want that bad news. Or if they do want the bad news, the people who are actually delivering the message are very wary of giving it, and they're thinking, okay, well, maybe things are not going so great this time, so if I hide it in this graph here, maybe by next month or by next quarter, things will be better. And I think it was Bent earlier on who was talking about the whole, embracing failure thing. I mean, there is no scope quite often to fail. And I think it's back to the point that you just made there, David, actually, because, it's only the failures that people sort of jump on you for. So I think it's something about making sure your language is straight, making sure the people with the right skills and competencies, and actually having the confidence to challenge and know that that isn't career limiting. And I think that, I don't know how many of you are from government, but there is something about, sometimes in some circumstances, if you wanted to challenge, then actually that could be career limiting. So there's a number of things to that. It's not a straightforward question, but an excellent one. I look forward to reading your research.
So I've been in the boardroom when that project director was there and made the presentation many times, and I don't think the problem is with the board members. I think the problem is with the project director, who's typically a nerdy engineer, who is deeply immersed in his or her, it's typically a he, in his project and all the technicalities, and do not have the imagination all the time. The person is also typically a little bit nervous because it's actually intimidating to present to the board. It's like being in front of the PAC that we heard about earlier to some project directors. And therefore you get these presentations where the project director who's presenting to the board just have no clue what it means to be in the shoes of the board and seeing things from their perspective, and there's a miscommunication. And I think that the project directors need to learn to put themselves in the shoes of the board before they go on the board, because it's true, you have these presentations and the board is sitting there like, when is this guy going to get out of here so we can get on with our business, and somebody can explain to me what he actually said, because there's always somebody on the board who can actually explain what the project director said. That's the issue, and that's not the problem of the members of the board, it's the problem of the project directors, in my view.
Since I am no longer a student of Ben's, I'm going to vociferously disagree. The problem is the boards. And you put up in your presentation this morning,
Well,
the whole line of great entrepreneurs of the last couple decades.
That's right.
And Steve Jobs was up there.
His
board fired him in the 80s.
That's true.
Being CEO of Apple.
I was going to be polite because you are my previous student. You know. But since you are now acting out, which is not what we taught you to do, I'm going to say you need a better board. That's all I can say.
I couldn't agree more.
Okay, good.
We'll try and make this Chatham House. Look, we're nearly out of time. I just want to pass the microphone to Pindi, one of our students who's just got a distinction, cohort 6. She did an amazing dissertation. I don't want to put you on the spot and talk about your bank in specific, Pindi, but talk to us a little bit about how engagement at the top level, both with the management board as well as potentially the executive board, can create better dialogue with the use of data.
Thank you, Atif, and thank you to the panel as well. It's been a very interesting discussion. So in terms of the senior board and the project board, there is a disconnect. We don't have project directors at the board level. And just from my experience, and Atif has met the CEO of UBS as well, the level of programs and projects tend to get shunted down, just like Ben said. It's not their top priority. So what we need to do as MPM alumni, as Oxford academia, is to actually highlight that and bring it to the table. So part of my research has highlighted the fact that we need to address programs. Banks are terrible at IT programs, and we have a lot of failures, but we can hide them because we are we're not facing the public. We're not using taxpayers' money. So I think there needs to be a lot of effort that goes into this, and it's not just one bank. I think it's probably across all the banks. So does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you very much. Look, will you please join me in thanking our panelists for the very, very valuable conversation. Thank you so much.